Recording in progress, thanks to the nice robot lady. So welcome back. All right, so for this half, we're going to talk about rendering in Arnold. And for reference, we're going to be using the Arnold rendering workflow doc. I'll give you a brief overview of it. We'll give you a brief overview of the exercises that you're going to be doing today. And we'll get in and we'll do a couple demos for you. The most important thing is for you to understand basically how Arnold works. So it all makes sense, actually. All right, so let's start off with getting to that workflow doc, which is in several locations throughout our instructions here. So like I said, it shows up as a PDF. If you want to download it, you can. So I will refer back here when I need to, but I'm going to be doing most of the demo inside Maya. Now, before I do that, though, I want to show you guys how you can check out which version of Maya you have and which version of Arnold. So this plugin that we're talking about, the newest version comes in with Maya 2020.4, but you will have to update to newer versions of Arnold. Now, depends. Sometimes Autodesk will bundle the new version of Arnold in with their 2020 release, whatever version they happen to be, that happens to be current, which is 2024. 2020.4. But you can't always guarantee or take that for granted, just like with anything. You want to make sure that you are getting the latest version. And I have to wait for everything to start up. So let me kind of shuffle stuff around here a little, just so I can make room. There we go. All right, so I have Maya 2024.4. If I go up to the Maya menu, go to About Maya, it should tell you the version number you have here if you don't see it in your Splash startup window. Now, when you have Maya installed, by default, you should have the Arnold plugin installed also. And you'll know if you have the Arnold plugin installed because you will have an Arnold menu. Without that Arnold plugin, that Arnold menu will go away. So basically, you can check your plugins under Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager. And the Arnold plugin will be here. It's called MTOA, Maya to Arnold. M2A. Right? It should be loaded, auto load, which is what you get when you have the default installation of Maya. Now, under the Arnold menu, if you go down to About Arnold, it will tell you the current version of Arnold you have. Now, the current version I have is 4.2.2. But the new version is 4.2.3. So if you have this green bar, all you have to do is click latest. And in your browser, it should take you to the Arnold renderer portion of Autodesk. And I'm on a Mac and I'm using 2020, so I want that. And it's going to say you have to log in. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and log in. And there's only one S in Full Sail. There we go. So then it's going to ask me for my password, which hopefully I remember, just like you guys. Okay. So it says, I must agree to these terms. Yes, I want to agree. Yes, I want to download. Thank you for downloading. There it is. There's my new package. So I click OK. When it's done, I'm going to log out. Why? Because I don't trust Autodesk. So while this is downloading, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the installer. And if it doesn't have me quit out of Maya, I'm going to quit out of Maya before I try to run the new version of Arnold, because honestly, it will not register as being updated while Maya is running. So generally, I actually like to do this with Maya not running at all. So it is taking a bit longer than I thought it would to download, because I basically uploaded a 400 megabyte movie in 20 seconds, but downloading, of course, it takes longer. All right, so play the Jeopardy song in your head. Do, 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 do. And there we go. Finally, package received. All right, so home. Am I still logged in? No? Good. All right, I'm out of here. All right, good. That's still good. There's my OneDrive. All right. So before I run the installer, I'm going to quit out of Maya, because I have done this in the past and forgotten to quit out of Maya, and the installation not worked. Because it was running, it couldn't overwrite the files it needed to overwrite. So when I ran Maya, it said, hey, you can't run Arnold because now you messed everything up. So learn from my mistakes. And that's really the only difference between you and me, is I've made a lot more mistakes than you have.
So when updating them, you're saying to update Maya first or Arnold first?
You need to update Maya first, because you can't use the new version of Maya in an old version of, you can't use the new version of Arnold in an old version of Maya. It will not recognize it. So Maya first, 2020.4, then update Arnold once that's running. All right, so now let's run the Arnold installation package. It's actually pretty simple. Just click continue, agree. And yes, I want this, continue, install. And of course, you need to type in your password. There we go, hit close. No, I don't want to move it to trash. I'm paranoid. I never throw anything out until I'm sure stuff is working. In fact, I have a whole folder full of stuff because I'm a pack rat. I'm a hoarder. Well, I'm a digital hoarder. So I got Maya installs. There's my old Arnold version. I'm actually going to keep that until I'm sure this is working. Why? Don't trust, but verify. All right. So that's good. What else we got here? Good. Okay. So in theory, that is running, or not running, but installed. So let's rerun Maya. Now, when Arnold starts up, I'm going to go to Arnold menu, about, and I should have the new version. We will see. Like I said, it's software, it's computers. Computers hate people. If anybody's ever watched Futurama, they're basically the Bender out to destroy all humans. All right, so first, I've still got RenderMan in there, so I got to wait for that to load. Then Arnold's going to load after that, I assume. There we go. Whew. Go ahead, take your time, Arnold. No rush. All right, so let's go Arnold, about, and it says I have the new version. So far, I'm loving life. All right, so that's how you check if you've got an update. That's how you update. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Just quit out of Maya before you run the installer. Yeah, Keyword is so far. Laugh out loud. Yes, exactly, Tristan. All right, so let's take a look at some of the key features in Arnold. One of them is this Arnold render view. So when I click on it, it comes up. It looks like pretty much any other render view. Let me resize it a little. For example, if I had something in my scene to render, I would just hit the render button. And it would render using whatever settings are in the render settings by default. So rather than just kind of guess at this, let me backtrack a little bit and talk about our assignment for today. All right, so this is your download. And when you download that little package from us, you will get this folder. And inside you will see 3 subfolders. So you've got an Arnold project folder. That's your Maya project folder. That is what you set your project to. Inside, we've got some templates. Let me get rid of those. Those are old. And I got reference images for you guys also. The reference images are there so you can see what your target quality is for the scenes that you're going to be rendering today. And what you're going to be rendering today is a choice of 1 day scene from this list of 4. Different camera angles, same location. And 1 night scene. Your choice, doesn't matter which one, you just need to choose one. If you choose to do the same composition as day, that's totally fine. Not interesting, but totally fine. Although it is nighttime, so it does look different. And you'll notice that in addition to, it looking different, I've also got some information about the camera that was used to render this from. So in the scene, I provide you with basically what we call render cams. Those are the cameras you use to render from. And I've got bookmarks in the render cam, so you can choose which one of these compositions you want to do. And you'll see that for the first composition, it has what's called a 16mm wide angle lens. Okay, so for the next one on the right side, it's a 35mm. It's still a wide angle lens, but not as small. Here's a 24mm, and these 3 basically are the most common wide angle lens settings that you'll see used. This one's 70mm. This happens to be a telephoto, which means we're magnifying the image from a distance away into the camera. So it creates slightly different look than the other camera lenses. Now for nighttime, got a couple of different camera angles. We still have the 16mm wide angle for that kind of long shot, I like to call it, because it includes a lot of the room. A little bit of a close-up here. It's still 16mm. Here, this is 50mm. 15mm is basically like a portrait lens. It's designed to not distort the image, either shrink it or magnify it. And then we have a 45mm, which is almost a normal. It's sort of high-end, wide-angle, very low-end normal. Just slightly different camera angles. Now, you're going to choose one of each. That's all you need to do. Then part 3, and by the way, all this stuff down here, this is showing you where the render cam is, and the render cam will be loaded when you open the scene up. But in order to change camera angles, you go to the bookmarks. So you have to be in the render cam, in the viewport, go to the view, go to bookmarks, and you can choose any one of the bookmarks. And that will take you and automatically fly you to the correct location, camera angle. And it will actually change the camera lens for you. So you have a render cam and bookmarks in the day scene and also one in the night scene because different lighting. Different lighting requires a different scene. Now, in addition to doing a day and a night, you guys will get a chance to do what's called a my comp. The whole idea is for you to experiment with composing a shot based on a reference image that you find on the internet. And the idea is to use our scene and our lighting, but to get the look and feel of your composition. So that means if you find a scene that's taken place during the day, you probably want to use our day scene. And what you do is you rearrange the geometry. It's basically called layout. Rearrange the geometry. You can't model anything. You can't change the lighting. You're kind of restricted in that. But your idea is to get the look and feel of the actual original composition. Now, if it's a night scene, I recommend you use the night scene that we have and just rearrange the geometry. You can duplicate, you can scale, you can hide, you can move. You just can't model or change lights. Now, kind of give you an idea of what this looks like, I've got some examples from previous classes. So here we go. So you can have as much fun with it as you want. So basically they took our day scene, the interior bedroom scene, kind of rearranged it so it gets the look and feel of this shot. And it's all about the composition and the staging. We're not worried about modeling. The models are never going to be one-to-one. They're never going to get the exact lighting. But the idea is, how creative can you be with limited resources? All right, so Toy Story happens to be a popular one. Make sure you got an image outside the window if you're going to be near a window. And that usually comes from not setting your project correctly. So again, overhead shot, kind of looking down. Again, it's all about staging, taking little elements in the scene, rearranging it so that it takes on the look and feel of your reference. So again, you can spend as much time as you want on this or as little time as you can afford. So obviously, bedroom scenes make a really good place to start. You can rearrange stuff. The idea is try and match the camera angle, try and match the geometry in place. That's the staging part. So it's a good chance to practice this kind of thing, which you probably have not had to do in camera in many other classes. So here, I kind of like this one just because it's got a nice vanishing point. They managed to capture that vanishing point here, and they managed to use the boards on the floor as, you know, kind of trolley tracks road. So here, you know, honestly, this vehicle should have been turned a little bit more like the reference. Probably would have been better to have this in another location where it's a little brighter, but it still works. Okay, it's all about staging. You can move objects. You can move, you can duplicate, you can translate, you can rotate, you can scale, you can hide them if you need to. You can't bring anything new in, you can't model anything, and you can't change the light. It's not a lighting exercise or a modeling exercise. It's all about just composition and a chance to play. So again, like I said, this one is very simple, but very effective. Camera under the bed. This one, they took the floor, they duplicated it, put it on either side, used a bunch of the boxes, made stairs. This one, they obviously got a bunch of different parts together and put this together to make this locomotive.
The objects you take, you don't have to use as like what they are.
Absolutely. In fact, you're probably not going to want to. You're just going to want to look at them as shapes, as kind of like primitives, primitive building blocks. As a kid, you couldn't take your blocks and sand them and cut them and reform them. You just took blocks as they were and put them together to make things. Honestly, it's creative play. So again, a lot of our elements are there. You've got a lot of things that you can do. They spent a lot of time on that one. So you get the idea, right? Don't stress out about it. It's really designed to let you explore layout, design, composition. Does that make sense? Questions out there in the Zoomosphere? Anybody have any questions? That kind of makes sense? What we're after? All right, Tristan's good. Excellent. Thank you. Griffin's good. Jose, Jasmine, Marley's good. Thank you. Adriana, Damien. Damien's good. For the last one, we make our own camera angle. Yes, you do. Now, you can use one of our existing cameras, but most of the time you're probably going to want to make your own camera and then frame it up. And I'm going to show you guys kind of how that works. It's a real quick, easy thing to do. Obviously, creating a camera is simple. It's like creating a primitive. You just need to look through the camera, and then we'll set up the resolution gate so you know exactly what you're going to get when you render. Okay. So we've talked about what you download. We talked about what we get. So this is what you're going to set your project to. And let me get rid of these scenes in here. So we got two Maya MB files. Get rid of that. I'm just getting rid of stuff that I had from last month. All right. Good. So what I'm going to do is set my project in Maya because it's the easiest way for me to show you how Arnold works is to actually use one of the environments. So file, set project, find your location. For me, I've got it in my documents. Lesson 1, let's open that up. I'm going to go in here, Project 1, SAL Arnold, and I want to click on the Maya, Project 1 Maya Project Arnold folder. So it's a Maya project folder for Arnold. Hit set. Then you go File Open, or click the little Open Folder icon. And I'll choose to do, well, let's do day first. So I'm going to open the day scene. When I open it up, it should be in wireframe and it should show up with the render cam at the bottom, which it does. So panels, perspective, there's the render cam. If for some reason you go out and you go into perspective, just go back to the render cam. Now, if I want to change camera angles in the render cam, I go to View, Bookmarks, and there are my different camera angles. So obviously you want to find out which one you want to do. So let's see, let's try the overhead one. That's the 24 millimeter, just for fun. Bookmarks, 24. There we go. Now, the first thing you really should do whenever you open a new scene up is save as. Why? It's Maya, it's liable to crash, and you don't want to corrupt the original file. Always work on a copy. So let's change this to 2021-07. There we go. It saved it for me. Now I can work guilt-free. If anything happens, I can just open up the original again and not worry about, oh, I overwrote the original file and I got to download it again. But I'm nowhere near any internet. Can I borrow a cup of internet? No. All right, so I've got this open. And let's take a look at, like I said, the Arnold render view, which is this button here. Now, this button is the Arnold render view that will open the window up and you will manually need to click render. If you hit this button, it will open up the Arnold render view and render automatically. Personally, I'd rather do it myself. I save that until I'm ready to do a final version. So right now I'm staring at a blank window. Let me just hit the render button. And it may take a second or two. Looks like I have the wheel of death, but what it's doing is converting the image that I have outside the window into a format that it can then render. And then it will start rendering. Now, when I'm rendering, I'm actually going to stop my talking head video just to save some resources. Now, you can see every pass that it does when it renders, it gets a little bit better. Now, I've got default quality on here, which is basically preview quality that I'm looking at as a render. So once it reaches this, it's going to stop because it says, okay, I reached my sample limit. So I'm going to click the stop button. All right, so there's a couple of things inside the Arnold render view. For instance, this, you can change cameras here. So I've got the perspective cameras, the top, the side, the front. Obviously, I want to keep it in my render cam, but it's there in case you want to render from another camera angle, especially if you're doing your own composition. You're definitely going to want to change it to the new render cam. Most of the time when we are trying to refine an image, meaning we're trying to figure out how many samples we need to make it look really good, we're going to use, instead of rendering the entire scene, which is kind of ridiculous, let's talk about what I got here in my initial render. All right, so in my render, I've got areas. I've got two distinct different areas. One is this area right here. Okay, this is direct light. This is a light in the scene. In this case, it's meant to be the sun coming in through the window, hitting the top of the computer, the desk, and the back of the chair. And also here. Notice that this has the least amount of noise in it in the entire scene. Noise being that gritty, sandy, grimy looking stuff over here. All this stuff, this is indirect light. This is basically bounce light. So in our room, bounce light is the stuff you see under the tables, over in the corner, anywhere that you don't have direct light shining on you. And this room is mostly bounce light. So indirect light always takes longer to clean up than direct light. So when I look at this scene or any scene like this, I always do a render at the preview quality, like the existing bare bones render standard settings that you get in Arnold. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to see where the noisiest areas in the scene are. And basically, that's all the areas of indirect light. So what I want to do is I'm going to focus my rendering on those areas. And in order to do that, I can use what's called the crop tool. So that means I can then come in, click on this little button right here. And this little button will basically allow me to draw a section that I can then hit the render button, and it's only going to render that area. So what it's going to allow me to do is make changes to my render settings so I can render out a small area, see when I start to get better results, and basically saves me a lot of time. I don't have to render the entire scene. Now, once I get an area that I think looks pretty good, what I'll do is I'll turn off my crop, and basically I'll go to another area. Like I might go over here in this area. Just render this area. Or I might go over here and render this area, another area with indirect light. And this allows me to fine-tune smaller areas. So when I get to a level of quality that I think is good, then I'm going to turn on my denoise imager. My denoiser is going to allow me to get rid of the last 5 to 10% of the noise in the scene. Now, let me stop my IPR here. Stop. There we go. All right, so a couple other things inside the Arnold render view, besides the render cam and the crop tool. So if I turn that off, now it's going to render the entire scene. So when you go to save an image out of the Arnold render view, you want to go File, Save Multi-Layer EXR. Now, what that's going to do is bring up a dialog box. So in this dialog box, it's going to probably try and save it right into your images folder, which is where you want it. Since you set your project, Maya is going to try to save all renders to the images folder. No, I don't have the crop tool on anymore. I turned it off. And you don't want to save small pieces of your image out. You save the save as for the final version when you've got your scene completely done, and you're saving it out to put in your template. So think of it for final versions only. Now, in Arnold, when you're trying to compare quality, you can use this snapshot button down at the bottom right. This little button down here will store the image I just rendered. So now if I hit the render button again, I'll let it render a couple more iterations. So I can compare. This is what it looked like when I stopped it really soon. And now this is what it looks like now. So this is my stored image, and that's what's going on now. So I can compare different versions using that snapshot. Now, it's real simple to manage all those snapshots at the bottom because you're liable to have 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. All you have to do is right-click and delete a snapshot if you want to get rid of it. It's actually pretty simple. So I'm going to save this one as my baseline render. So if I want to save, say I'm going to pretend this is my final version. I go File, Save Multi-Layer EXR, give it a name. When I save it, let's call this test. If I save it, it will save it with the EXR extension. So I saved it. It went into my project folder. It went into my images, and here it is. So, I mean, that's a terrible image, but you get the idea. And it's an actual EXR. So it's really funny, but I mean, it's a crappy image, but it has such high quality potential. It's like, that's a 6 megabyte image. It should be a whole lot better, but I didn't give it anything better. So yeah, I'm going to get rid of that. That's gone. All right. So a couple other things in here. Well, actually, this is pretty much the meat and potato. Oh, yes. If you want to bring an image in to use as reference. So for example, we give you reference images of what the final renders should look like. So go into references. If you take a look at them, these are images that have been rendered and had the denoise imager applied to them. So that's my target. That's what I want it to look like. So we have images for each scene. So let me bring in my reference here. And to do that in the Arnold render view, I go File, Open Image. And I have to navigate to my folder, which is Reference Images. That's my image. Once I find it, I click Open. And now it's here. I can compare and I can go, okay, I got a lot of work to do because there's my target. And this is what I currently have in the way of my render. Does that make sense so far? Questions? Anybody out there? Everybody good? Okay. All right, so I got my target in here. Now what I want to do is, oh, by the way, when you click on your snapshot down at the bottom, notice it turns blue. That's telling you you are now looking at one of the snapshots. And when I turn it off, everything off, now I'm looking at my render view and what's in my render. But like I said, what I want to do is start to drill down and get this to look smooth. And this is indirect light. So let's go into the render settings. The render settings are this little icon. Looks like a little clapper with a gear in the bottom right. You click on that, and that brings up a couple of tabs in the render settings window. So the first tab is common. Any renderer you use in Maya will have common features. It'll be things like, what camera do I want to render from? What is my size? So here's my camera. And this is, I'm controlling my camera in the Arnold render view. This is if I want to render it out using image sequence, or I want to render it out using another Arnold feature, which we don't have with the free version of Arnold and Maya. It's called batch rendering. We don't get that because as students, they're not going to give you something that they want you to buy commercially. It's nice that they give us a good renderer with a denoiser, but we don't get the ability to render in a batch. But we do have ways around that, which we'll get to in Project 4. Don't tell Autodesk. Actually, Arnold tells us how to do that exactly in their render settings help doc. What's that?
Like maybe we are using Maya software or something, but I do think we have done batch renders before.
You can do them in Arnold, but they come in with a watermark, and we don't use watermarks.
Oh, those, they would if you went about it a certain way, but the teacher who taught our class told us about an alternate way that doesn't get you the watermark.
That's what we're going to use. That's called sequence rendering.
No, it was still batch rendering.
Not really, unless you weren't using Arnold.
That's the thing. I don't know if we were.
Yeah, if you weren't using Arnold, you can batch render all you want in Maya. But with Arnold, you get a watermark, and that's not professional. And there's no reason for it. What's that?
It was in portfolio, so I might ask the teacher about that.
Okay, so anyway, we have common areas like what's the file name? What kind of output are we doing? So for this is pretty much standard. None of this, except for image size, will affect our Arnold render view. Our image size is set up already. We are rendering at HD 540, which is 960 wide, 540 high. We're interested in the Arnold render view section. All right, so this is really where all the work happens. So let's go into our render doc that we have here. So I kind of gave you, the only thing I haven't shown you yet is the denoise imager, which is actually very simple. So I'm not going to do that yet. But what I want to show you is how the render settings work. So the Arnold render tab, this is where the bulk of what we're going to be doing, the magic happens. So you really need to understand what exactly is going on. The main number of samples in your scene is called camera AA, camera anti-aliasing. This number is the square root of the number of rays per pixel shot out in your scene. So when we say square root, this number is the square root. So what is the total number? Well, it happens to be 9 because 3 times 3 is 9. 3 is the square root of 9. So right now, these are the total number of samples in the scene for direct light. Now notice there's another one here called diffuse underneath of it. And these are the two that we're going to be concerned with for the first 5 projects in our scene. The reason is we're not worried about specular transmission or subsurface scattering until we get into materials. Right now, we're just trying to make flat gray stuff look good. And that's what we do in rendering and lighting. We don't want to be distracted by color or material properties, being shiny or dull. So diffuse down here, this is indirect or a bounce light. Now notice it says 2. This number is also the square root. So 2, right? It's square root basically of, well, 2 is the square root of 4, right? But how do they come up with 36? Well, here's the way it goes. You have 9 actual samples per pixel. And then the square root of 4 is 2. So when you multiply 4 times 9, you get 36. So this number is the master multiplier of all the other samples underneath of it. And then this number down here, this is the square root. This adds in extra samples to other areas like indirect light, specular, shiny stuff, transmission, clear glass, subsurface scattering, skin, candles, wax, milk, things that have a lot of what we call subsurface scattering. So looks a little confusing, but here's the bottom line. Camera AA between 2 and 3 is preview quality. Let me zoom in a little bit here. Let's see. Can I zoom in here? Do I have to download it? I don't want to download it. Yeah, all right, I can zoom in. Not let me zoom in. All right, well, forget you. And I'm not going to download it. Just go back. Actual size. There we go. Okay. So anyway, the default that we have in our render settings of 3 is preview quality. Honestly, when I see something like this, I'm going to go, all right, well, what I want to do is I'm probably going to put it up to medium quality. I'm going to put it up to 4. And then I'm going to increase my diffuse, which is my indirect rays. I'm going to put those at medium also, somewhere between 4 and 6. So usually what I do is I will go from the default settings here, and I'll go, okay, well, let's go up to medium quality, put this at 4. I'm going to put this at 4. And then instead of rendering the entire scene, I'm just going to render out a small portion here. And let's see what those new numbers look like. Now, it's going to take a little bit longer because I am increasing the number of samples. And notice when I increase this to 4, all of a sudden, 4 is the square root of 16. And then 4 is the square root of 16. So 16 times 16 gives me 256. That's how I'm getting 256 samples in indirect light. Now you say, okay, well, that's like 4 times the quality. I should see that. Well, yeah, sort of. Here's my original. That was the default 3 and 2. Here's my new one. That's the 4 and 4. But there's my target. Now, as I mentioned before, direct light cleans up much, much quicker. So normally I will leave my camera AA here. And then what I'll try and do here is I'll probably go like 6. Because you'll see I'm still going to get 16 samples for direct light. But I'm going to get like over 500 samples for the indirect. So let's re-render that. And all the while, I'm trying to compare it to this. So I reach a good enough level of quality so I can start to turn on my denoiser. Now, in theory, I could turn my denoiser on sooner. But the problem is, I want to try and get it as clean as possible without being distracted by something that I may fool myself into thinking is good enough quality. So this is going to take a little while, as you can see. And actually, let me make this area smaller still. Yeah, let's go about that big. All right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to backtrack a little. Let me put that to 4. Let's render that out. All right, let me keep that. Let me stop this. Let's turn my diffuse up to 6. Let's render that. And basically, I want to compare what the difference between 4 and 6 is. Now, notice it's crunching because it's sending a lot more samples out. There we go. All right, so this is with my diffuse at 4, and this is with it at 6. So you can see it's a little less noisy. Let me keep that. Let's stop that. So there's 4, there's 6. I'm going to crank this up to 8. And honestly, 8 is usually, that's kind of my go-to number for indirect. And I'll usually try and keep my camera AA at 4 without making my scene too long to render. Occasionally I have gone up to 6, but it does increase all these numbers a lot. So you'll see even the difference of changing the diffuse from 6 to 4 is going to change my render times, even for that little tiny swatch. There it is. So here's my swatch. This took 9 seconds to render. That's with the camera, or sorry, not camera, but the diffuse at 4. This is what it is at 6. Notice it took 21 seconds. And now at 8, it took 35 seconds, but look at the quality difference between that. That's actually pretty good. Here's my target. Now, at this point, I've gotten rid of a lot of the noise. I'll probably get rid of about 85% of it. So what I want to do now is I'm going to turn on my denoiser. Now, the denoiser can be found in what's called the display settings. It's the little gear icon inside the Arnold render view right here. Now, if you're using an older version of Maya, you will not have a post tab here. That's only with Maya 2020.4 did the new version of Arnold start with this. And basically with post, I want to add an imager, and I'm going to add the denoiser, and it's called noise. Now there's one optics. Optics is for people who have PCs and have NVIDIA graphics cards. This denoiser is all software. That's what we want for the Mac. So I click on that. The default settings down here are actually very good. I explain what those default settings are here, what they do. So the variance, which is right down here at the bottom, that is basically how much noise is removed without making your render too blurry. Because honestly, denoising is about smoothing out, and smoothing out usually means we add a little bit of blur. So the default of 0.25 provides a good balance between removing noise and not making your render too blurry. The patch radius, which is this one right here, that is what is the area of denoising softness. So you increase the softness of the denoising area, but you try to preserve the features. So the default version of 3 is sufficient for most scenes. Then you get into the radius. This is the area of pixels that are being denoised. Again, this radius of 9 pixels works out pretty good. So with this turned on, all I have to do is hit the render button again, and it will render this scene again, but it will denoise this small area for me. So now, once that's done, I can compare my denoised render with my reference. So it is going to take me at least 35 seconds to render out this piece, plus a little extra time for the denoise function. All right, so you'll notice it's done. I'm going to stop it. So this is what it looks like before denoise, and this is what it looks like after. It's amazing what that little denoise filter can do. So here's my reference. This little small area right here that virtually looks the same as my reference. So honestly, I'm going to go, you know what? That's pretty good. What I would do is I would then render this entire frame. Now I would take off my crop, hit the render button again, and it will render out the entire thing. When it's all done and denoised, then I would go up and save image. Save multi-layer EXR. So I'm going to pretend this is my final version. Now, at any time, if you want to turn off the denoiser just because you want to try rendering without it, all you have to do is right-click on it and disable it. Then it comes up. Nope, did you quit? Okay, remember those settings that I talked about, that how usually updates create stable releases? Don't believe it. Because I read the stuff last night and I'm going, you know what? I'll bet if I demo this tomorrow, it's going to quit out on me. So, of course, what happened? I probably didn't save my scene with all the settings that I had. And of course, all the renders that I had are gone, except the one I think I saved. Oh yeah, okay, I did get my version out here, the one with the little cropped area that I wanted to use as a demo. So this is one of the reasons why we generally don't jump in and, oh, Maya 2022, yeah, let's use it. No, because it usually crashes. Arnold, well, we'll have to see. Jury's out. This is my first demo. I am streaming. I am recording. I am rendering. So, I mean, it's a lot to ask on my laptop. So I'm willing to forgive Arnold a little bit. Let's set project. Let's see where we're at. Yeah, here, in here, on there, right. Okay, well, at least I got that much. Where are my render settings? What do I have here? Okay, so I got default settings. Honestly, what I wound up doing was this. That's where I arrived.
You're only really talking about the first two. Should you just leave the others as default?
Oh, yes. Don't touch those because we don't actually have anything in the material to warrant using specular or transmission. So yeah, everything else stays default. The only ones you're really worried about for today, on Wednesday, on Friday, are going to be the first two. Those are really the core. Everything after that is when we add in materials and when we add in texturing. And you'll be able to tell when you need to use them because you'll have a shiny object. The rest of the scene may look really clean, but the shiny object, right where it's shiniest, has a lot of noise. And that's because there's not enough specular. Or you've got glass and you can see through it, but there's noise as you see through it. That's because transmission needs to be increased. So you'll know, hopefully by that time, you'll be acclimated to what to look for, and you'll be able to spot where the noise is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good question. All right. So fortunately, I really didn't lose a ton of stuff. And I got to demo mostly everything I wanted. So let's go on. Same thing with the night scene. So Leah, let me open up the night.
Remember the denoiser we want is the one that ends with noise.
Noise, yep. That's their, I don't know why they use that name. It always reminds me of a Key and Peele episode where they're outside doing hip hop dancing and guys yelling, noise. All right, so let me save this real quick in case I have to open it again. Let's go into the nighttime. Going to do the same thing. Just to show you, give you a quick idea. I'm going to choose this because I've got something outside the window, hopefully. There are images outside the window. You may be able to see them. Actually, let me go to a different camera. No, not that one. About this one. Yeah, this one I can see outside the window. All right, so let me do a save as. Just going to do a quick render. There you go. So you can see an image. It's nighttime or it's dusk. Yep, lots of fireflies. You're going to get those because that's the noise. So this is going to take longer to render because there's a lot more indirect light here, a lot of bounce light, and there's a lot of small little indirect lights too. We've got a lamp behind the camera here on next to the bed, which you can actually see here. This is the one I'm working on, which is basically the camera's back here somewhere. No, don't need that. That's good. Yeah. So default, notice it takes a little bit longer to render out than the day scene. And then you would do the same thing here. Basically just choose your image, bring in your reference. There's my target. So I would pick an area, indirect light that's got a lot of noise in it, and start working on increasing the camera AA like I did for the day scene, increasing the diffuse, which is indirect or bounce light, and turn on your denoise imager. And again, that's under post, add imager, denoiser noise, set up to go. And basically I can just start rendering. Now, with the camera settings at the lowest, I have my denoiser on, but notice it's kind of splotchy here. That's because I don't have enough samples.
That makes sense, 'cause like all the, so just to confirm, all that the denoiser really does it for it, right?
Not completely. It has an algorithm in it that kind of tries to not just blur, but average samples or average pixels together. That's why it kind of looks splotchy. There's probably a lot more subtle gradation and light here, but it's just grabbing pixels in a 9-pixel radius and just kind of making them conform to each other. Yeah, that's basically what it's doing. And the more detail or the smaller your little bits in your collage are, the more detail you can have. And that's basically what we're doing here. That's a great analogy. Yeah. All right, so there we go. As I increase, let's bring this up to 4. I'm going to turn that up to 4. Let's render that out again, that little piece. See what we get. And of course, it's going to take a little bit longer to do. So you can work with the denoiser down at this level. I usually try and let the first 2 go by without, I'd rather try and get rid of most of the noise before I turn it on. But you can see it's better. It's still got a little bit of splotch in it. Compare that to here. In a small area, whatever I have cropped. So I can turn that off by clicking this button, and I can go turn it on again and go to another area. Yes, and that's why if you do a small area, it saves you a lot of time rather than re-rendering the entire scene. Like I will do crops in a couple different locations. Like I'll do one here, maybe one over here, maybe one over here. If I can get them all to look equally good with the reference, I'm pretty confident that when I hit the render button for the entire scene, it's going to match the reference. Does that make sense? Good. Because honestly, that's like the hardest part of Arnold, is just doing that. So if you understand how this goes, and just understand, even if you're kind of lost on the square root of and this and that, and I turn this up and holy crap, now it's 4 times what it was last time. Well, that's because it's 4 times here. Just go in here and look and go, oh, preview quality, medium quality, high quality. Use those as a range. And honestly, most of the time I try and keep my camera AA at 4 or 6. And I'll usually keep my diffuse at 4 or 8, or sorry, 6 or 8. It's very rare I'll go down to 4 for the diffuse, because bounce light, diffuse light, indirect light is always noisier than any other kind of light. It always requires more sampling. So use this doc. This will kind of give you a good walkthrough on, Arnold, how it works. Like I said, I spent a lot of time going back and forth, getting this stuff off of Arnold's website, because it's not all in one place. This is all in like 15 different places. I'm like, this is crazy. So I just decided to put all the important stuff for us into one doc that you guys can use as reference. All right, processing. So it looks like that's probably done, or pretty close to it. So that's really the basics of rendering, and how Arnold works. It's really quite simple. It's quite painless once you get everything installed, and that means Maya and getting the updated version of Arnold. All right, so one more thing I want to go over before we adjourn for today, and that is basically, let's talk about cameras, because I want you guys to have a little bit of background for your My Comp. All right, so camera lenses, which is really what we're dealing with in project one. That's why I give you examples of what is my focal length, what kind of camera is it. So camera lenses can do one of two things. They can focus light or they can disperse light. There are four main camera lens categories. The lower the size, and camera lenses are measured in millimeters, the lower the size, the more the image shrinks onto the camera sensor. Now I say film here, but it's really camera sensor. Everything is digital now. Hardly anybody shoots to film unless you're a stylized photographer now. It's just so much cheaper to shoot and get instant feedback with a digital camera. Especially since you can get cameras now that are indistinguishable from film. The resolution is so good. Anyway, this first category of lens is called a fisheye lens. And basically what it does is it tries to shrink as much of the image as it can onto the camera sensor. Think of this fisheye as looking out the peephole of a door. You know how you look out the peephole of a door and everything looks all distorted? Well, it's designed to give you almost a 180-degree view of what's on the other side. And it's called fisheye because notice there's curvature at the top of the glass here, just like the eye of one of those fish sitting in Publix on the ice. Right there. So you get what is called this barrel distortion. This curvature in the lens causes a curvature in the horizon. This horizon would normally be flat, but because of the lens, it bends and distorts light. Like I said, it's a really cool effect, but very stylized. Most of the time you can tell, you know, a fisheye lens just by looking at it. It's usually used in games and film to really make the viewer feel uneasy. It's all about creating a very distorted, warped perspective of what reality is. Yes. Depth. Notice it kind of bubbles the front and makes the background, midground background really elongated. So anywhere between 2.5, 15 millimeters is considered a fisheye lens. You know, from what I've seen so far, I mean, usual fisheye lenses are like 9 millimeters, 12 millimeters, somewhere in there. When photographers buy lenses that are called fixed lenses, that means you can't change the focal length on them, they will usually go in and buy a set lens like that. Now, the next category is called a wide angle. It's got a little bit of curvature at the top, but not nearly as much as fisheye. It will still shrink the image, but not to the maximum onto the sensor. So a friend of mine shot these. He's a photographer. This one was 24 millimeter, and this one was 16 millimeters. So you can see this one kind of has that bubble distortion a little bit in the front. And it kind of has that elongation for the midground and background in the back. This one's 24 millimeter. So 16, 24, and 35 are probably the most common wide angle lenses. Like a photographer goes out, buys a lens, that's probably one of these. Now, having said that, every single one of Maya's cameras by default is a 35 millimeter lens. So when you go into Maya, let's go into Maya. And let me create a new scene. Just going to throw a ground plane in here. And let me throw a sphere or 2 or 3. Let's just do that. Pull that sphere up off the ground so it sits on it. And let's duplicate that. Control D. Oh, stop doing things. Control D. All right. Control D. There we go. Okay. So I create a camera. Go create cameras, camera. There's my camera. I go into the attributes for the camera. It's a 35 millimeter. Oh, and by the way, your perspective camera that you get is 35 millimeter in every default Maya scene. Your top, your front, your side, everything is 35 millimeters. So when you're going to be working, you basically want to change it. Now, when you create a camera, my camera is right here, just like any other object in Maya, it's dropped in at the center of the world. Center of the world being the origin point on your grid, right? So there it is. If I want to use that camera, I have to go to Panels, Perspective, and then choose the name of the new camera. And then now I have to kind of navigate around. And I also want to click on this button right here called Resolution Gate. That will basically frame it using my settings in the render settings for size. And that's always under the Common tab. So down here, it's framing it for my HD 540. So now, anything I render, I can be guaranteed that this is pretty much how it's going to come out. So 35 millimeter. Notice if I take it down to say like 9 millimeters. Watch, everything kind of comes toward me as I move in, as I zoom in. Look how distorted that is. Now notice I don't get the curvature that I get with a real camera lens. Unfortunately, Maya doesn't do that curvature, but it does give you the distortion. So, you know, oh, I'm going warp speed. So now, as I increase it, let's go to 12, you know, slightly less distortion. Let's go 24, slightly less distortion. You can still see there's some distortion. 35, not bad. We're used to seeing that, but there still is some distortion. When we get around to, oops, there we go. When we get around into the 50 millimeter, this 50 millimeter is basically a portrait lens. That is the most common lens that a photographer will use for a portrait. It basically does not shrink or magnify the image onto the film or camera sensor. So the idea is a lens is chosen based on the characteristics of the image that it takes. Do you want that barrel distortion? You need a fisheye. Do you want something to look expansive but not quite as distorted as a fisheye? Well, guess what? You're going to use a wide angle lens. Like I said, 35 millimeter. That is probably the most common lens used by realtors when they take a picture of your apartment or your house, your backyard, your front yard, a room. Makes everything look expansive. When you get there, it's like, oh, it's a shoebox. But not to diss realtors, it's just the way it is. You want to show something in the most possible or in the most flattering way possible. But normal lens, 50 millimeter, it does not shrink or distort. Or I should say, it does not shrink or magnify the image. If you're a modeler, you really want reference images shot with a 50mm lens for the most part, especially if it's an object, because you don't want to model in distortion based on the camera angle. Now, not to say that, in your career, you will have varying levels of quality, I should say, for reference that you receive, no matter how big your organization is. All right, so the last lens type is called telephoto. This is when you are magnifying part of an environment, a scene. In this case, really good example, sports photography is always shot with a telephoto lens because you can't be on the field of whatever activity, whether it's soccer or hockey or baseball or football, depending on American football or actual football, which is soccer. You just can't be in the location. So you need to shoot from a great distance. Well, yeah, exactly. And then you better move really quick. Yeah. Yeah. Trying to maintain your subject and not get hurt at the same time. Oh, yeah. Well, you must have been doing video. Yep. So if you're doing still photography, you have the like the barrel of a cannon on front of you. And basically you need a unipod to put it on because you can't possibly hold it steady and have it not wobble. Same thing with you, except you got a shoulder. Yeah. Oh, for sure. Plus you have a big, heavy battery pack on there too, unless you were wearing a belt. Okay. Got it. Yes. Yeah. I got a good shot. Yeah. Well, I'm in a hospital now. I got a broken leg. Well, that's good. So anyway, the problem with using a telephoto is we get this thing called lens compression. When you're magnifying something from a far distance away, you are basically taking foreground, midground, background really far away and bringing it forward, making it bigger. When you make it bigger, you are squeezing the planes together, foreground, midground, background. So it creates lens compression, which makes it hard to tell the distance between objects. So here, this example on the right, the buildings, it's hard to tell whether the buildings are attached, whether there's a highway in between them, an alleyway, you just can't tell. Same thing with the players as they overlap here. You really can't tell how far away each player is from the other. So depending on what your reference looks like, it could be any one of these 4 lens categories. Chances are, unless it's really noticeable distortion, it's probably going to be wide angle. If it's a portrait, it's probably going to be a 50mm. If it looks like it's sports or it looks like it's something shot really far away, it might be a telephoto. But this will at least give you some ideas on how to check to see if you are, well, if you need to change the focal length in your camera. So as I started to show in Maya, we've got 50mm here. Once I start upping it to like 70, and like the common telephotos are like 70, 100, 200, 300, 400 millimeters. Yeah. I mean, it can go all the way up to like 1,000. But the bigger the number, the more compression we get. Like right now, they're almost starting to look like they're side by side. But, select my camera again. But if I switch it down to 35mm, I guess I have to type it in. There we go. And zoom in, you can see that they are not side by side. I don't have that lens compression. Yeah, now compare that with this.
It looks like the further away one was a lot bigger than the ones closer. Forget, like they were different.
Well, that's based on the properties of them.
It makes it look like
Well, it always looks flat to me. Like I'm losing that sense of volume, that sense of depth, that foreground, midground, background. Whereas with the lowers, like 70, that's, you can pretty much still get a pretty good idea of depth, but you're starting to lose it a little bit when you compare it with like 50. Yeah. So basically, quick tutorial for camera lenses for you, because it may help you out when you are looking at reference images on the internet, and also for your stuff. Try different lenses, see what the effect is. Have fun with it, be creative. Like I said, be warned, every single default lens camera in Maya is going to be 35 millimeter. You want to turn on the resolution gate. That will give you this kind of, it's basically kind of a knocked out area around it that's grayed out. And it'll give you a frame that you can rely on for composition. Well, focal point, but it's more like this is where your render is going to happen when you hit the render button, when you render from that camera. It's guaranteed. That's why that resolution gate is really important. Now you have other things you can turn on, like safe action and safe title. The buttons are up here. We're not doing animation. We're not doing titling or putting anything with readable type in it, because nobody does titling in Maya. You can take it into another program and do it. But the idea is, if you've got something with type on it, you want to keep it away from the edges of your frame. It's all about composition, right? Rule of thirds, golden mean, leading the viewer's eye around to the focal point or the area of interest. And as a photographer or a cinematographer, that's your job. Your job is to help the viewer look where you want them to see, make it interesting for them. All right, so that's what I wanted to go over before we hit on break. Anybody have any questions? Everybody good? Allegra, Gaia? Okay, good. Josh and Diamond are good. All right, how about out there in the Zoomosphere? Tristan's good. Thank you, Tristan. Let me take a screenshot for attendance. Jasmine's good. Griffin's good. All right, so we will take a 1 hour break. So we'll call this like 11:15. Come back to lab, which will be here on campus for you guys, and also in Zoom. We'll be running it in Zoom as well for anybody who can't make it into campus. So let's come back at 12:15. I will lock the room up here on campus so you guys can feel free to leave your stuff. I will be here for a little bit, and then Frank will be in here, and Ari will probably be here too. You get a chance to meet her. All right, so have a good day. I will see you guys on Wednesday, same time, same room. We're going to start lighting on Wednesday. So see you at 12:15.